Hi, this is Angie. We recorded this following conversation before Susan G. Komen did the right thing and reversed its decision about Planned Parenthood. I still encourage you to listen. There's a lot of very good information that goes well beyond the hot headlines with this controversy. So do listen and enjoy. Thanks.
Hello, and welcome to another In Deep radio show. I'm Angie Coiro. Okay, there's no way we were not going to talk about the Susan G. Komen Foundation today. No way. There's so much in that story, and a lot of it is behind the really hot headlines. There are things that need to be questioned, even if the Susan G. Komen Foundation had not yanked its funding for low-income women's breast exams from Planned Parenthood. So, true to our name, we're spending our hour kind of going in deep on that one, looking at breast cancer research, looking at conflicts of interest, looking at the politicization of science. There's a lot going on there, so we're doing that this hour. In the next hour, Indiana is now a right-to-work state. And that does sound so righteous, doesn't it? I want to work. I want the right to work, don't you? Of course, right to work is corpo talk for union busting. And now Minnesota is rattling those same chains. They are moving to go in the same direction, lining up behind 23 other so-called right-to-work states. So we're going to spend that hour on a roundup of union legislation around the U.S., then an analysis of how unions are fighting back. And that includes, by the way, what the unions need to do to clean up their own act. This is not an unabashed pro-union hour. There's a lot the unions need to clean up. So we're going to go into that next hour. But right now, Susan G. Komen, oh my. Perhaps Susan G. Komen Foundation has set the latest world record in mealy-mouthed, dishonest prevarications in the face of public disdain. It's just been amazing. So let's break this down. Let's do an ABC summary, shall we? A. The Associated Press reveals the decision the foundation made last year to stop funding Planned Parenthood Federation's low-income breast cancer screening program to the tune of $600,000. That's point A. Point B. Intelligent human beings observing this note that just under a year ago, a virulently anti-choice, anti-Planned Parenthood politico had become vice president of the Susan G. Komen Foundation. Karen Handel was the former Secretary of State in Georgia and ran for governor there on an anti-choice platform. One of her proudest accomplishments, as noted by the Department of Justice, was establishing a, shall we say, problematic series of hoops for potential voters to jump through. So problematic that the DOJ said fully half of those screened out, in fact, had every right to vote. They were full U.S. citizens, but they were screened out of the voting process. And I think you ought to sit down if you were easily shocked. The overwhelming majority of those screened out were Black, Hispanic, or Asian. So the aforementioned intelligence-observing human being said, Handel is now in Planned Parenthood, or Handel is now in Susan G. Komen, and Planned Parenthood is out. Interesting, huh? So we go back to our ABCs. C. The Komen Foundation was shocked that anyone might perceive this as a political move. Oh, heavens forbid. C. The Komen Foundation was absolutely shocked that anyone might perceive this as a political move. Heavens forfend. Politics? No. It was a matter, you see, of their not being willing to give grants to groups that are under investigation. And well, Planned Parenthood is under investigation. You know why? Because another virulent anti-choice legislature has a witch hunt underway in Congress for which other Congress people have rebuked him. And regardless of whether there's an investigation going on, which pretty much anyone in the legislature can start at whim, Planned Parenthood has not been found guilty of anything. In fact, they're facing no legal charges, but the Komen Foundation says they just don't fund groups that are under investigation. Except, yeah, they do, actually. Adam Serwer for my alma mater, Mother Jones Radio, looked into this claim. Because despite this claim, they really didn't come out with a list and say, in addition to Planned Parenthood, we have funded X, Y, Z, and B. They didn't seem to defund anybody else under these rules. Well, Adam Sewer looked into this and found out that Penn State gets money from the Susan G. Komen Foundation. And Penn State is under investigation. Roughly the same caliber of what Planned Parenthood is being looked into for, except that maybe this might have some validity to it. The Penn State lab is the subject of a federal government investigation. I'm reading now from this Mother Jones article. Like the Planned Parenthood grant, the Penn State grant appears to violate the new internal rule at Komen that bans grants to organizations under investigation by federal, state, or local governments. The Hershey Center there is affiliated with, currently under investigation by the government. Penn State is under investigation over the sexual assault scandal involving Jerry Sandusky. But in 2008, the Komen Foundation awarded a 5-year, $7.5 million grant to the Hershey Center to study treatments that could reduce the risk of breast cancer. Now, have they revoked that grant? Au contraire, mon frere, as far as we know, that is still in effect. So this stuff is kind of starting to pile up. And the person who founded the Susan G. Komen Foundation in the name of her late beloved sister found her seat hot enough that she felt she ought to be making a public statement. So she has now gone online to explain in her own words this decision. Let's listen.
Hello, I'm Nancy Brinker, the founder and CEO of Susan G. Komen for the Cure. For 30 years, Komen has always strived to deliver the highest impact in communities through our breast health grants. Recently, we implemented new granting strategies and criteria that some have regrettably mischaracterized. And I wanted you to hear from me personally about why we feel these changes were necessary to further our mission. Thanks to your support, just this year alone, Susan G. Komen was able to invest $93 million in community grants across this country. We want to continue to fund grants at this level every year.
Yeah, absolutely. She didn't talk for 45 minutes, but she talked a full 3 minutes, and nobody heard any relevant words. She didn't address the facts or the accusations. So here's the shorthand version. I can save you going online listening to this. She said, blah, blah policy, blah, blah misapprehension, blah, blah scurrilous accusations, blah, blah research. Did she address points A, B, C, or D? No. Those were pretty much left untouched. So what we have here is a clearly political decision that they're saying is clearly apolitical. A lot of people haven't fallen for this. Numerous senators and congresspeople now have decried this and said, you know, you are politicizing the health of human beings. You are politicizing the health of women. They haven't changed anything. Nothing. No response there yet. This is not a political statement. This is not a political issue. Might it have something to do instead with the fact that Susan G. Komen's founder is a major GOP donor and an ex-President Bush ambassador? Maybe. Might it have to do with on the Komen's Advocacy Alliance Board is Jane Abraham, General Chairman of the anti-choice, anti-science Susan B. Anthony list and its Political Action Committee? On the same board, Maureen Scalia, the wife of Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia? It looks like politics, if not overlapping the folks at Susan G. Komen Foundation, is sitting at least uncomfortably close. If something this smelly were sitting uncomfortably close to you at a party, you would get up and walk away. Well, we can't tell them to get up and walk away, but we can spend this hour on a calm, rational analysis of the Komen Foundation, of breast cancer research, and what used to be Komen's priority, which is helping women with cancer, is the best way to spend this hour. And we're going to spend this hour with Gayle Sulik. She's devoted years to looking at these very issues. She's written a book about the pink ribbonization of breast cancer, Pink Ribbon Blues, GayleSulik.com. We're going to put that link on our website. Of course, we're discussing the problem with Susan G. Komen and Planned Parenthood, but we're also looking at breast cancer research as a whole. A lot of people seem very surprised at the political nature of what happened in this past week. There are always politics involved in research because there's money involved, and money equals politics. And there have been questions before about Susan G. Komen's allocation of money for research. And in general, what is the best way to fund this kind of research? So that's what we're looking into with Gayle Sulik. And the book's entire title is Pink Ribbon Blues, How Breast Cancer Culture Undermines Women's Health. What is breast cancer culture?
Breast cancer culture, I'm specifically referring to a pink ribbon culture, and it's the way that there are certain values and norms and ways of coping and being that surround breast cancer. So if you think of breast cancer, what do you think? You think pink. Mm-hmm. What does pink mean? It means femininity. It means gender. There are certain norms around how you cope if you are diagnosed. You are a survivor. What does it mean to be a survivor? Well, in this culture, part of that involves language around war and fighting words and having courage and strength and optimism. But also because it's pink, it involves being a good woman, a moral woman. And so all of those things come together to create a culture that shapes how people can think and act when they're diagnosed.
It's interesting. There's been kind of a kickback against pink. I think the Pink Breast Culture campaign is one of the most successful branding efforts I've ever seen. I've been around advertising my entire life. But the backlash is coming in on a couple levels. Even before this latest incident with Susan G. Komen, little girls were starting to say, hey, enough of the pink. I don't necessarily want to be a princess. I don't want pink Legos. And now, of course, with this additional issue with the Komen, pink is getting a little bit of an askance look. One of the first things that hit that hit society when they really started to examine this was when prominent author Barbara Ehrenreich had to deal with cancer in her own life, and she rebelled against what she felt was the forced optimism, the cheerfulness of the pink. Basically get that pink ribbon out of my face. Do you think, with all the women you've talked to who've had to deal with cancer, does that have resonance with them?
I wouldn't say that it resonates with all of the women, and I would jump back and say I would never say all, but it does not resonate with many. And I think that, you're absolutely right. There has been a kickback, and I think, surely all of these norms, be optimism, be a fighter, be aggressive, all of that, people resist that all the time at different levels. But some women have really, really come out in a backlash against it. I think because it's so ubiquitous, and it's almost as if you don't do it that way, then you're not a good enough survivor. And so not only do you have to deal with cancer, but you get an F in survivorship. And that's one of the things that they're really rallying against. But in addition to that, it's the consumption piece. You can't go anywhere without seeing something with a ribbon slapped on it, and that's somehow supposed to signify support and awareness.
Well, in fact, the group Think Before You Pink has gone into depth, and I know you have some acquaintance with this as well, as to what people perceive that pink ribbon on the packaging meaning and what it actually means. So you have this idea, if you walk in and you have a choice between an item with a pink ribbon and an item without, if you buy the one with the pink ribbon, some of your money is going to go to breast cancer research.
Yeah, that's a huge assumption, and it is an assumption. And so the first thing I always say is never assume, because you really don't know. And some companies are getting better about actually putting fine print on merchandise, so they'll say, 10% of whatever is going to an organization. But a lot of times you don't see that. You'll see, if you see anything at all, you'll see language like supports the fight, supports the cause, funds breast cancer research. That's a big one. And people assume that it's going to organizations, but they'll assume even more than that it's going to research. And often it's not.
Well, in fact, one of the things that Komen has been criticized for, if I understand, 24 cents of every dollar actually goes to the cause of breast cancer research. And by almost any charity report card, that's not very strong.
The research report is troubling, and actually historically they have spent about 25% of their program budget, give or take, in the research category. That's gone down quite a bit in the last 6, 7, 8 years. And when you take a look at the administrative costs that are also built into that program budget, it's even less. So somewhere at this point, around 16 or 17% of the total revenues are actually going to research grants. And that is something that bothers a lot of people.
You know, I'm kind of wryly amused as I talk to you because I can hear what a calm, rational person you are, what a journalistic approach you take to things. And yet I see the headline of the article that you put on your website, GayleSulik.com, Beyond Hypocrisy, Komen for the Cure's Assault on Women's Health. And your opening line is, it's difficult to be any less than infuriated for its tactical decision to stop giving grants to Planned Parenthood. I think I'm just getting the impression from this brief talk with you, it takes a lot to get you infuriated.
I'm a pretty calm person usually, but I think this and systematic. Researchers do that. You can't spend 10, 15 years plugging through data and not have a somewhat calm, I think, demeanor, or you'll go crazy. But this really is infuriating, and I think when you've lost people to cancer, most of my colleagues that I work with on a regular basis and friends have breast cancer, or they've been diagnosed with breast cancer, and I've lost people to breast cancer, and lives really are at stake. And so as all of this hoopla flies around, I keep coming back to the fact that people really are dying. Literally, people are dying. They are in treatment. They're suffering side effects. And I don't really see the pink parties helping that situation. And then seeing this thing happen with Planned Parenthood is very disturbing. The women who need health care the most are the ones that are being used as a political pawn.
And you note in your article that you're not buying the Susan G. Komen explanation that there's nothing political about this decision.
No, I'm not buying it. I think it's very convenient the way it happened. Bringing Karen Handel on board as the public policy person, that was a very strong thing to do. It's a very strong anti-choice thing to do, and she had consulted for a number of months before she was hired, and it's just interesting that you would bring someone on a public policy agenda who had a very, very clear plan to defund Planned Parenthood on the front end.
Gayle Sulik is with me for this hour. We're going to continue to talk about the Susan G. Komen decision to defund Planned Parenthood. We're going to talk about their funding. Susan G. Komen, in fact, started with pharmaceutical funding. And if that's their beginnings, and it continues to be their reality, how impartial can they be in the research that they fund? That and more about Susan G. Komen here on In Deep with me and Gayle Sulik. I'm Angie Coiro. Stick around. Welcome back to In Deep. We're all over the Susan G. Komen story here. I'm Angie Coiro. Gayle Sulik is my guest, and we've got her website linked on our website, lftlc.com. Her name is spelled GayleSulik. That's GayleSulik.com. Gayle, some news came out that I guess will not shock you. I wouldn't be surprised if you hadn't heard it yet. We're recording this on Thursday afternoon, and Mother Jones has just published the news flash that although the Susan G. Komen Foundation said that Planned Parenthood's funding had been dropped because it is under investigation and that conflicts with their standards, there is in fact another group under investigation funded by Susan G. Komen that has not been taken off their roster. Penn State apparently is under a parallel investigation. I wasn't really surprised to hear that. What surprised me early on was that they didn't say, well, we took off Planned Parenthood because they're under investigation, as we have done with A, B, C, and D. And of course, A, B, C, and D was not forthcoming. Someone else has now uncovered it. What does this do to your impression of Susan G. Komen as a credible institution that can be trusted?
Oh, that's a loaded question. It's very disturbing. And I think one of the concerns really is the fact that Planned Parenthood seems to have been singled out. Komen has, I think, around 2,000 community grants on average that it funds. and only one has actually come out that apparently meets this criteria of being under investigation. And this is, it's a broad criteria, under investigation at local, state, or federal levels. Well, you could come out and declare an investigation and never really do it, which is cause for concern. But then how is this organization going to systematically go in and look at all of the organizations it would potentially fund and make sure that they're not being investigated, even in their local communities? It would be a lot of work to do. I don't see it happening. But I think Komen does need to come out and answer that question very well.
Susan G. Komen Foundation was started with, in addition to other funds, started with pharmaceutical funding. One thing I am not, and I think my listeners know this from knowing me for a number of years, I'm not a purist. I know that, for example, you can't say, I am nothing but an environmentalist. A, you'd be naked all the time. B, you'd probably not eat much. There are things that we can't be pure about. So in my mind, pharmaceutical money may have an appropriate place with a group that is invested in research. And by invested, I mean in the spiritual sense. Their goal is to do good research. But it has its obvious limitations because pharmaceutical companies make money off pharmaceuticals. What do you see as the appropriate role for a company that makes pharmaceuticals, that is dependent on that for profit, and yet may in fact have a genuine clean interest in wanting to see research done properly?
Yeah, I tend more toward an approach where you need very, very strong systems in place to avoid conflict of interest, because there will inevitably be a conflict of interest there. And you're absolutely right. Pharma has an interest in making money. In general, even in pharma itself, when you look at budgets, you see sometimes more money going into direct-to-consumer advertising than you see going into R&D. It shows the market desire, the bottom line desire of economics, and that needs to be taken into account. And some breast cancer organizations, and Breast Cancer Action is one, Breast Cancer Action in Montreal also, have very strong conflict of interest statements that their boards of directors have created, so that they will not take money from any entity that has the potential to make any money off of the diagnosis or treatment of breast cancer. And, that's a strong statement to make, but I really honor them for making it, and I think that some organization as large as Komen should really think about that as well.
It's an interesting conundrum because, of course, there's a ton of money in pharmaceuticals, and when you say we're not going to have anyone writing us checks who has a fiscal interest in the outcome, you're cutting yourself away from an awful lot of money. Do some alternative sources come to mind? I mean, if that's the line that a research foundation is going to take, where else can it find that level of funding?
Well, it's a good question, and that's an issue that a number of organizations are facing, particularly in the nonprofit sector, and especially if they are engaged in some way in the health arena. And it's a tough call. It's a very tough call. But I think it really does come back to a thoughtful approach to conceptualizing policies that they can put in place to ensure, in some manner, that a conflict of interest will not occur. And they can do that thoughtfully. They actually could accept money from pharma if these other things were in place that would show that they were not going to affect how they deal with their members, how they deal with the organizations they fund, what they promote in terms of treatments and medications, and they could put that in place.
Speaking of promotions, I want to remind our listeners, you're listening to Gayle Sulik as we talk about the story behind the Susan G. Komen defunding of Planned Parenthood. Speaking of promotion, Gayle, we talked a little bit before about everything that the pink ribbons appear on. One of the things the Komen Foundation has come under criticism for is doing campaigns, for example, hand in hand with KFC. And here's the pink ribbon, anti-breast cancer on a bucket of lard and saturated fat. Which of course there's a strong connection, as I understand it, between a poor diet and breast cancer. Again, it's that double-edged sword. KFC, ton of money. What they're pushing on the people that are buying it now because there's a pink ribbon on it, very questionable. Does that give you pause?
Right, it does. And it's a really good example. Obesity is connected. It's a risk for any number of health conditions, including cancer and breast cancer. And so you do have to wonder how anybody ever could have thought that was a good idea. Promise Me perfume is another one. Komen came out with a branded perfume named Promise Me, which is basically, it harks back to the promise that founder Nancy Brinker made to her sister Susan Komen, who had died and was the inspiration for the start of Komen. And it actually has been found to have toxins in it and potential carcinogens. And Breast Cancer Action called them out as the pink washer of the year for that reason. And so, at some point, I do start to wonder if the branding and the self-preservation and the money has not taken precedence over some really deep thinking about how they might achieve their mission.
Can we talk a little bit about the women whom Komen and the other cancer groups are set up to support? I can only imagine having breast cancer. I have had friends who've had it. I've held some hands through. I've never had it myself. Being a political person, I can imagine that along with the deeply personal and along with the purely medical, I would start to become aware of some of the politics behind the research. I can imagine having breast cancer and seeing the Promise Me perfume come out and Komen defending that or defending their link to fried chicken. I think I'd have a lot of anger there. Is that projection on my part? Or with the women that you have talked to, have they become politicized? Do they become aware of the politics? Does it bother them?
A number of them have become aware, and what I've found, and I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of women, and men and caregivers and people in the health arena as well. And what I have tended to find is that, you're right, when you're newly diagnosed, the only thing you can do is deal with the fact that you're diagnosed and what that means to your life and your family and your job, everything, and then get through treatment. And that's a job in and of itself. A lot of people, when they're diagnosed, they're also dealing with financial issues and taking care of families. There are all of these things that happen. So oftentimes I've seen that the politicization of it doesn't occur until a little bit farther down the trajectory. Usually if someone has a recurrence, if someone doesn't do well in treatment, someone moves on to metastatic disease, then they'll realize, wait a minute, this didn't work out the way I thought. It didn't work out the way all of these awareness messages tell me it was going to work out. And then they will start to look into it. And then what they find is more likely to make them angry. It's not true across the board, but I've seen that general pattern.
And when they start to get angry, what is that? How does that manifest itself? Do they get on picket lines? Do they start writing letters? What have you seen?
I've seen a variety of things. Direct actions are picking up. Social media is becoming an important tool for people. Breast cancer social media is a tweet chat that's become one of the most popular ones. People will come on there and talk about issues and organize. The organizations that have been kind of working against the industry around breast cancer for some time, where it's starting to use those mechanisms as well, and people will join those organizations. But I think one of the reasons you don't hear it, we tend not to see lots of picket lines anyway. That was, something from the old days of activism. Now you're seeing this stuff show up in blogs. You're seeing it show up through Twitter. And people are starting to work within their communities, creating smaller groups as well. And a lot of it happens through word of mouth.
This is interesting. I hadn't really thought about the role of the instant media with this. And of course, the Komen thing was a big deal on Twitter right away. How does that figure into dealing with and recovering from breast cancer? I assume there are blog support groups online?
There are lots of blogs. There are virtual communities that kind of sprout up in different places. And one of the things that you some of these are formalized. You might go into a particular site and connect with a community there. But a lot of people who have started blogs, for example, they will just go in and start to read other people's blogs. And then when they find someone who resonates with them, they start to connect. They comment on each other's work. They'll email each other, and virtual support groups just appear. They're kind of organically. And I see a lot of that happening, and it's happening through that virtual world. And some of them who didn't do as well in face-to-face support groups, because there are also things about interaction that happen there, and politics and particular organizations that run support groups, they'll often leave those support groups, will go on to social media, and then they'll find their people there. And that happens quite a bit.
Gayle Sulik is the author of Pink Ribbon Blues, How Breast Cancer Culture Undermines Women's Health. And we're talking about the developments around Susan G. Komen and Planned Parenthood, breast cancer research as a whole. Gayle, one thing that happens when you start to examine the influence of money on research, and in essence anything where there's a large fiscal underpinning, it's easy to fall overboard into conspiracy theory. I've literally heard people say that pharmaceutical companies don't really want to solve the question of cancer. They don't want to cure it because then they're going to be out of money. That sounds a bit extreme to me, but I can see the underlying concept where cancer is something of a cash cow for some groups. How much reality do you put into that?
Well, money talks, as you know, and if economics is the bottom line, it has to factor into decision making. And so while I would agree with you that I wouldn't go in and say there's some conspiracy theory out there that pharma does not want a cure for cancer, but I would say that there are major barriers to finding cures that are market-based. And one of them, yeah, I know you're going to follow up and ask me about that.
Exactly, I am.
Yeah. So one of them is that in order to have a drug be profitable, you need a large enough population to get that drug too. And so that's one of the reasons you see tons of things on TV for, cholesterol and blood pressure and any number of things that you could market almost to everybody. But when you start to get into a smaller segment of the population, it becomes more and more difficult to market a drug. And what has happened with breast cancer is that, for one thing, it's not a singular disease, and there are many different biological markers that affect the type of a breast cancer somebody has. There will never, ever be, ever, one drug that you could give to that whole population of women. And researchers that I've talked to in pharma, bench scientists in pharma, have said that they, because of that reason, they are often held back in moving a drug forward in research because it will not reach a big enough population.
That's depressing.
It is. It's depressing to them as well. And so I think another thing that's happening is that, marketing departments and research scientists don't necessarily talk to each other. Mm-hmm. Same thing happens in hospitals. It's a separate division. They market, they brand, and then the people on the other side do what they do. And I think that separation has also been part of the problem.
Is the research targeted then to the most prevalent kinds? Is there enough spillover between the kinds of cancer that what benefits one will pretty much inevitably benefit the other?
There's not enough spillover. And that is one of the issues. So something that people have been concerned about quite a bit is the fact that metastatic breast cancer in particular is the least funded of all types. And so once you have a metastasis, and sometimes people call it stage 4, that level of research is the least funded of all of them. And that is the one that actually kills people. If you die of breast cancer, you're going to die from a metastasis usually. And so that's an important consideration. People who have certain biological markers, a drug might work for one, but depending on the combination of what those other markers are, it may not work for another person who has that marker.
Do I understand correctly that a breast cancer is one kind of cancer in its early stages, and once it metastasizes, it literally becomes a different kind of cancer?
It can be a different kind of cancer at an early stage as well, and it depends. For example, sometimes estrogen in the body feeds a cancer, and sometimes it doesn't. that would be a biological marker. Does it have the marker for estrogen to feed it, or doesn't it? That would be an important distinction even for an early cancer.
Do women learn this all as a crash course as soon as they get a diagnosis of breast cancer? I mean, this is a lot to take in a 1-hour program, imagining being thrown willy-nilly into this world by a diagnosis.
Breast Cancer 101 is a crash course, and and usually it doesn't get to that level of understanding. When you're told you have breast cancer, or when you're told you have cancer of any other kind, all you hear is the C word. You don't hear any distinction about the biological markers and the pathology report and any of that. And so it really is it's a different language. And if people really, really go in depth in order to make as informed decisions as they can, then they really do have to take a crash course to figure out what it's about.
We've got another segment to come, this conversation with Gayle Sulik about breast cancer research, the Susan G. Komen Foundation, and its pulling of funding for Planned Parenthood. Funding, which I should repeat for those of you who didn't hear earlier, this funding did not have anything to do with abortion. The funding went to low-income women's breast exams, and unfortunately that funding has been restored by good donors from around the country. So we'll get back to this topic with Gayle Sulik in just a moment here on In Deep. I'm Angie Coiro. Welcome back to In Deep. I'm Angie Coiro, talking to Gayle Sulik, and she has been spending a good long time now researching the pink breast cancer culture, the research behind breast cancer. She came to my attention when she wrote a blog post on the Susan G. Komen Foundation's decision to defund Planned Parenthood grants that were helping to underwrite women's breast cancer exams for women of lower income. I don't know if by the time you and I talk about this, Gayle, it's going to be a closed case. We've got 48 hours before this show actually airs. But do you see or have you heard any indication this funding might be restored, or do you think this is a done deal?
Ooh, I don't know. I'm waiting with bated breath to see what happens, like everybody else. I know that they're certainly getting a lot of pressure, and 22 senators have already come out and signed a letter asking Komen to rescind this decision and to restore funding. Whether they'll do it or not, I don't know. Founder Nancy Brinker has already come on the air in a number of places saying that they stand strong, that it was a sound decision, and stands in support of it. So I don't know what they're going to do. I really don't.
Well, for those who are dismayed by the decision, who may or may not have given money to Komen before now care to put their money elsewhere, let's talk about what some of the options are. There are groups that look into researching. There are groups that give aid to women themselves. There are groups that work more on prevention and on screening than they do on the actual cure. So let's go through some of those. If I were looking to support a group that makes sure women get proper exams and proper early care, who would I be talking about funding?
You want the name of a specific organization?
Yeah, or a place where we can get that information.
Uh-huh. Okay, well, the first thing that people could do is they could go, there's a search engine called GuideStar, and you can type in breast cancer, and you can actually get a list, and you can filter it by state or by city, and you can find out every organization that is in that state or that city, and you can actually go in and look at them. There are more than 1,300 in the country. So there are a lot of organizations out there focusing on different things. Some are reputable, others are not, so you have to do some digging and really look at what they're doing. Some notable organizations, which I think you're trying to get me to answer as well.
Well, I don't want you to I definitely don't want you to endorse anyone, so we're going to make it clear.
Yeah, just some notables. Just to give some texture to what it is I'm saying. Some notable organizations, for example, that are focusing on prevention. One of them would be the Breast Cancer Fund, which has a report called State of the Evidence, and that report has reviewed, I think it's in its 6th edition now, and it has reviewed all of the evidence that has looked at environmental connections to breast cancer. And the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences has even endorsed that report. So when I think prevention, that's an organization I think of. When I think of large-scale policy changes and how we can think about research differently, I think about an organization like the National Breast Cancer Coalition. They are based in Washington, D.C., and they have a campaign right now called Deadline 2020. And it's focusing on changing the conversation around breast cancer, but also changing how research is done, how it's coordinated, because there's a lot of people doing a lot of different things. They don't necessarily talk to each other, and they are seeing that as a barrier to progress, and I would agree with them on that. So that's an organization people could look to for that. An organization that focuses specifically on metastatic breast cancer would be one like Medivivor. Medivivor, yep, and they specifically focus on getting research funds to researchers who are looking into metastatic breast cancer. But there are a lot of organizations, so these are not endorsements per se,
right?
But just examples of the types of different things that organizations are doing.
You know, you mentioned policy and necessary reforms in policy. One of the complaints that we hear about breast cancer and its high profile sometimes is that it has a disproportionately high profile and a disproportionate level of funding, you know, as opposed to how much of the population it actually affects or which cancers might affect the population more. Does that have any legitimacy to your ears?
It does, actually. And it is the top funded cancer at the federal level. Lung cancer kills more women. Heart disease kills more women, for example, than breast cancer. And so that is a concern. You know, I have written some about ovarian cancer, for example. The BRCA genes, the breast cancer genes, that sometimes are in the news a lot, they implicate both breast cancer and ovarian cancer. And yet you don't see similar levels of funding for ovarian cancer. So there is an issue there in terms of the attention and the funding that basically is funneled into breast cancer. But the unfortunate thing is so much of that money doesn't even get to breast cancer. It's in the name of breast cancer. It's in the pink, the pink zone. But just because all that money is out there in the name of breast cancer doesn't even mean that it's actually getting to women and directly helping women. Sometimes it does. Oftentimes it doesn't.
Well, devil's advocate here. Let's say Susan G. Komen. Let's say we're going to fault the foundation because, you know, some ballpark 20 cents on the dollar ends up going to actual research, which the impression they give that that's what they're about is raising research money. Devil's advocate says their profile is so high, they do so much, there are so many product tie-ins that 20% of their dollar is more than 80 cents on somebody else's dollar because there are more dollars.
Right, and that would be true. That would be true. And at the same time, that money, and I think this is one of the things that we've seen with, it's a huge organization. So it's just interesting that as the revenues, and I've watched it, I've looked at the audited financials, and I've watched the revenues go up every year. And it's even slated to be I think 480 million in 2011. And as those revenues go up, the money to the research grants has gone down, and I keep asking myself why. So even though there's still a chunk of money, you got $58 million going to research, why is it that allocation keeps going down? And I don't know the answer, but I ask the question.
Oh, one of the things they're faulted for is that they dedicate a lot of money toward going after people who use the phrase "for a cure." If you're selling cupcakes for the cure in your little coffee stand, they'll go after you with their lawyers. And if I understand correctly, that's $1 million a year for them in legal fees.
There has been litigation toward other organizations over a number of iterations of the phrase "for the cure." That million, if it's $1 million, and I don't know if it is or not, that's small potatoes when you have 480 million to work with. At the same time, I also worry about what that means just in the spirit of helping people with cancer and the spirit of getting organizations to work together toward this singular goal, which we say we want, which is to help the diagnosed and maybe someday eradicate this epidemic.
Let's put together everything that you and I have talked about this hour, and let's build ourselves an organization. And this organization is going to look for funding through proper channels, and it's going to work to actually allocate money to the research. But we have the challenge of getting our public face out there, of maintaining a high enough profile that we get the money to come in. How do we do that latter part? How do we get a high profile without compromising the first part, which is prioritizing the money and prioritizing money coming in ethically?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, and I've actually reviewed a number of community-based organizations that are not involved in breast cancer, and because I wonder, are breast cancer organizations, because of the attention, are they doing things differently than other organizations? And one of the things that I tend to see is that there is this push toward the fundraising, the funding, the awareness. But organizations that don't actually have that leverage have to find other ways to function. And the way they do it, and some of them do it on a shoestring, it's incredible to see how little some of these organizations can work with and get a lot done, is they actually have to build ties within their communities, build collaborations, and gain investment from people who have the same goal in mind. So they may go to their local hospital, their local university. They may go to churches and schools and other organizations and bring people into the fold who want to give of their expertise in order to reach this goal. So it doesn't always have to be financial, and at the same time they can still have really powerful outcomes in terms of their mission, and especially in terms of health and I'm losing my voice. Health outcomes.
You're losing it to a great cause.
That's in their mission. And it's very impressive to see what people can do if they've got the leverage behind them in terms of the in-kind expertise to work toward their goal.
Yeah, another thing you kind of brushed up against earlier, and I wanted to pull it out and expound on it, was the duplication some of these groups have, one to the next. I often hear people say, well, in the name of so-and-so, well, this is how the Susan G. Komen group got started. In the name of my sister, I'm going to start, a breast cancer research organization, or in the name of whomever, in the name of whatever, I'm going to do this. Is there any way to break down the walls of ego and separate identity between these groups and get them to coalesce their funding, start the umbrella organization to bring in all the others? What are the challenges there?
Yeah, ego can come into it, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there with some of the organizations, because there is a tendency among some, and it's not only breast cancer, but you lose someone to a disease or to some issue, something that happened, and you may want to do something in their name to change that, and that happens a lot. And at the same time, if you really want to deal with the social problem, you have to move beyond that individual perspective. And so some of those organizations, they just aren't going to do that. That's not their mindset, because that's not what they're about. They're about remembering that person and doing something in that person's name. And getting, collaborations to happen, it's tough across the board, but the National Breast Cancer Coalition, again, it is a network, for example, of over 300 organizations. There's also a network in New York State. It's the only statewide network of breast cancer organizations in the country, and they have come together to think about, what is the consensus across the organizations in our state? How can we help each other? How can we not duplicate our services? And, it's not always done perfectly, but at least that effort is there, that spirit is there. And so there is one example that other organizations could look to make that happen.
I'm going to attack one of the great respected icons of breast cancer research, and that is the walk. Going on the cancer walk, and Avon has a cancer walk, and there are other cancer walks, and of course Komen is known for the 3-day cancer walk. Call me a cynic. I never knew what fallen arches and really sore feet had to do with solving cancer. Is that a productive use of time? I know it generates a high public profile, and it's hard to put a dollar figure on that. And I know it sweeps people in that otherwise may not be involved, and it lets the individual have some sense of power in actually gathering up money. Is it in fact productive, or are there better things that the organizations could be putting together that have more directly to do with cancer?
There are a lot of things that organizations can do, and the walks and those kinds of events have become very popular. They're actually not a great way to raise money. They're getting very, very expensive, partly because there are so many of them. And now, these events are vying for time and space on the calendar, literally in the geography of cities where are we going to hold these kinds of things. Often, coincidentally, they're at malls where you can buy stuff afterwards. But, so that is an issue. It's not necessarily the best way to make money. But you're right that the profile is very high. And some of these have almost become, to bring in consumption again and pharma again, some of them have become expos for medical technologies and treatments and those kinds of things as well. And Samantha Ping has written about that also. So that is also an issue. But in terms of what people get out of it, some people really get a lot out of it. They go, if they've been diagnosed or if they're walking in somebody else's name, there is something about being in a group of people together for a reason that seems like it's bigger than yourself. And I think that is powerful for people. If they then find out later that goodwill is being exploited, then I think they're going to get mad. And I think that's where we're at right now.
I hadn't heard the word exploited used in the context of this controversy, but I think you really, really grabbed hold of it there. I've seen so much feedback on the internet with tweets and with, commentary on the YouTube video that was released by the founder of Susan G. Komen. And yes, I think people feel like their goodwill and their pocketbooks have been taken for a ride, or at least hijacked by a political agenda now. I guess exploitation hadn't entered my mind, but I think you've got something there.
Yeah, I think so too. And I've heard other people just on the periphery who have been talking about this issue describe that feeling. And whether it's because of hawking pink products or because of this political issue, there's an idea that individuals who are diagnosed, individuals who are sick, are being exploited in the name of breast cancer, and yet the monies, the efforts are not necessarily helping people in their situation.
Well, there's a tiny silver lining to this controversy, and that is I'm very glad to discover you and your work. What's next for you? What's your big project now?
Well, one of the things that I'm working on is really to get a sense of the entire breast cancer movement, because as we've talked just in the last 45 minutes, I guess, I wanted to kind of get across to people that there are many organizations out there who are working on various dimensions of cancer, breast cancer, treatment, support, research. There are many spokes on that wheel. And so one of the things I want to really get a sense of is how organizations are collaborating with each other or getting in each other's way, because we see that, and to think about that question of duplication, the question of policy, which agendas are moving forward, which are being held back. And that's a big project, but that's the next one on the list.
Thank you for all your excellent work. I really appreciate your taking time out to talk to us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Gayle Sulik's book is Pink Ribbon Blues, How Breast Cancer Culture Undermines Women's Health. We'll put a link to her book and to her website on our website at lftlc.com. Gayle Sulik spells her name Gaylesulik, and that's her website, gaylesulik.com. Her book is a good thing for you to pick up and give a good read to if anyone you know is dealing with breast cancer. It's Pink Ribbon Blues, How Breast Cancer Culture Undermines Women's Health. And We are an LFTLC production. What does that mean? That means we are made by Live from the Left Coast, our company in California. You can find archived versions of our show and all of this information I've been referencing throughout the show at lftlc.com or indeep.org. Our executive producer is Gordon Whiting. Our engineer is Matt, Where's My Free Coffee Fiddler. Opening music by Big Troubles. Our closing theme is by David Gans. You'll hear that in just a moment. If you want more information on breast cancer and on breast cancer activism, go to thinkbeforeyoupink.org, and that is a project of the Breast Cancer Action Foundation. They are at bcaction.org as well. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you once again next time we bring you an hour of In Deep on WPWC 1480 AM, Dumfries, Virginia, Washington's progressive working community.